Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 30th, 1956. Look in your wallet, friends. Pull out a dollar bill. You can hear it, Theater of the Mind. That's a dollar bill. The motto on there, it says, "In God We Trust." And it was on this day, July 30th, 1956, that was formally adopted as the official motto of the United States. It would in turn begin to appear on all of the bills. It is, of course, on many coins. You can hear those.
It's really going in with the sound effects.
Yeah, we need more sound effects on this show. The coin thing is actually a little more complicated of a history, so we're going to get into all of that history and why it's complicated and how we ended up with "In God We Trust" as our official motto. Let's talk about that with, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And our special guest for this episode and next is Kevin M. Kruse, professor of history at Princeton University. Hello, Kevin.
Hey, guys.
You wrote a book about this, Kevin. It's not a coincidence that you're...
I did,
yeah.
Okay. I have a couple things to say.
Okay. Well, why don't you start with this? E pluribus unum, and then In God We Trust. In my mind, both of those are sort of floating around as mottos of the United States. Describe those two, and then we'll get into this particular moment and this particular shift. But how do those two play into each other?
Right. Well, E pluribus unum was, for a long time, many Americans assumed was the motto of the United States. A Latin phrase that came from the obverse side of the seal of the United States, had been there since the late 18th century, but never officially the motto of the United States. Congress never officially passed that. So In God We Trust becomes the first official motto of the United States in 1956 and push aside this one that many people assumed had a place in law but never had.
So what is it about the 1950s that causes Americans to discover God for the first time?
Thank you for that setup, Nikki. As I argue in my book, One Nation Under God, there's a period in the early 50s, really from 52 to 57, the mid-50s, where a wide array of things that Americans now take for granted. You snap that dollar bill that everyone has in their wallet. There are a lot of things like that we take for granted that all came to being in a short span of 5 years. So In God We Trust becoming the national motto and being put on paper currency for the first time. It had been on coins, but paper currency for the first time happens in that period. It's also when Under God is added to the Pledge of Allegiance. It's where we get the National Prayer Breakfast, the National Day of Prayer, the chapel on Capitol Hill. But there are a lot of things that happen in that short span of time when Americans really find religion in a serious way. And they've done that before. There have been the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and so on. There have been religious revivals. But this is one that I argue in that book really imprinted itself on American political culture in a lasting way. So as that religious revival subsided in the 1960s, those markers, those things that were literally written on our money, on our stamps, on our currency, on the halls of Congress now, became permanent.
Yeah, and there's a really important context here, which is that this is in the middle of the Cold War. I mean, Americans, especially from the view of Europeans, had been sort of famously a religious people, but there had been some separation here and there between the church and the government. And in this moment, as they're trying to heighten the contrast between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, there's kind of this attempt to really lean into the religious nature of the United States against godless communism.
Exactly right. The movement for this, what I call under God politics, had really begun back in the 1930s. And it's not about the Cold War originally. It's about corporate America fighting against the New Deal. And they contrast the slavery of the welfare state to freedom under God. And it's largely a cause of the political right until the early 50s, when a wide range of Americans from across the political spectrum, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, not just Protestants anymore, but Catholics and Jews, embrace this new politics of one nation under God, and they do so in the context of the Cold War. From Eisenhower on down, they had, as Niki said, sought to contrast America with the Soviet Union. The top two adjectives describing the Soviet Union in this period are godless and atheistic. Sometimes they used them both. Godless, atheistic, communist, in case you didn't get the point. So what better way to highlight what America was and how it was different than the Soviet Union than to play up the godly nature of Americans, right?
But is what you're saying that the sort of protection of religion or the centering of religion in this period is about religion itself and feeling like religion is under threat, or is it more that religion starts to get conflated with other political projects at this time?
Well, religion gets conflated with other political projects. If you look at the status of American religion in this period, it's not only not under threat, it's incredibly thriving. The 1950s are a period in which church attendance, church membership is at an all-time high. The churches are thriving. Churches and synagogues are thriving across America. And they're thriving in part because of this moment, which is basically telling Americans, go to church. There's an ad campaign, go to church. The president is telling people, Eisenhower is telling people, go to church. And so it's a constant theme that comes down from the top that really builds up religion. But religion is built up, again, first as a bulwark against leftist politics of the New Deal, but then seen as a national protection against the onslaught of international communism, that religion is going to keep America safe.
So you name-checked Eisenhower, and I have to say, like, if I were going to think about holy rollers in the Oval Office, I would think of like Jimmy Carter, who was a Sunday school teacher. I think of George W. Bush, who was really overtly a born-again Christian. But somebody like Eisenhower does not strike me as the one who would be leading the charge on bringing God into government.
Yeah, we don't think of him in that way. But really, Eisenhower was a deeply religious man. In fact, he told reporters he was the most religious man he knew, which is how they think. But he was, and he never belonged to a church. And his parents and grandparents were members of various sects, the Mennonites, the River Brethren, Jehovah's Witnesses. So he kind of floated around between different denominations. But he knew the Bible. His family was, as one of his brothers said, they were all fundamentalists. He was famous in the military in World War II. His aide said he could quote scripture by the yard. He constantly invoked it. And so Eisenhower, when he comes to office, really does come with an idea that America needs religion. And he saw religion as both something that would protect it from foreign threats, but more importantly in his eyes, it was something that would tie Americans together, right? That coming out of a period in World War II where religious and racial bigotry had been exposed as a weakness, not just at home, but abroad, the idea that you could tie Americans together by the one thing that they all had in common, which he thought was religion. And Eisenhower believed that America didn't, he said, America makes no sense, our system of government makes no sense unless it is founded on a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is, which is the perfect Eisenhower quote, that you need to have religion, any kind of religion, and that's all that mattered. It didn't matter what the substance of it was. You just had to have a religion, have a faith, go to church, right? And this is borne out by Americans at the time. Again, church membership is at an all-time high, but not many people knew what was actually going on in church. Polls are great on this. They show that like 80% of the country believes in the divinity of Jesus Christ, but about a quarter can name all four gospels, right? It's not a very thick, deep religion. But Eisenhower really does a good job of promoting this in this era.
But that word God that gets included here, I mean, how truly expansive is that word? Or is there a particular God and a particular interpretation of God that people have in mind?
That's a great question. So as I note in the book, and I borrow a term by Yale Law School Dean Eugene Rostow, who calls these phrases, one nation under God and God we trust, he calls it ceremonial deism. And ceremonial, he meant it wasn't important. I argue completely opposite, but it's very important. We live by ceremonies. But the deism was a key part because it's never an invocation to Jesus Christ, right? It's never an explicitly Christian presentation. It's instead God. right? It's something that theoretically Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, an expansive sense of religion can somehow get behind, right? And that's how they frame it. And anytime they try to hone in on Jesus himself, in 1954, there's an amendment to the U.S. Constitution proposed that would recognize the divinity of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
An amendment to the Constitution?
That failed.
About Jesus?
That failed. That
Whoa.
same Congress, though, adds under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, right? So there you can see there's a certain level to which they're willing to go, but they realize once they cross that line, once they get beyond a general vague God into Jesus, that coalition behind this is going to fall apart.
You've definitely triggered Jody's esoteric political history side with the Jesus bill. I mean, I would just add that the other thing that's going on here is this is the period at which people start embracing the term Judeo-Christian and trying to bring together a more pluralistic approach to religion. And there were plenty of religions that were left out of that. There was still plenty of religious discrimination, but this is a moment when God is more palatable in this civic religion sense than Jesus.
Kevin, this passes unanimously in the House and the Senate. Was there any pushback, any debate? And then I do want to talk a little bit about kind of the legacy of this and the pushback that we've seen over the years. Yeah,
there's a little pushback. Not a lot. But one of the things that surprised me the most researching this is I did a lot of work in the ACLU papers and the papers of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Americans United for Separation of Church and State, again a mouthful, but an important organization, was at this time known by its original name, Protestants and Other Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. They didn't care about general invocations of God. They cared that Catholics were getting taxpayer money for Catholic institutions. So as long as you were vague with this, they didn't care. The ACLU doesn't hear about this until the House has actually passed the bill. And then they still are reacting to it as if it's some kind of rumor. We think this thing is going on in DC. So there's very little opposition. And once they find out, they decide, yeah, that's fine. It's 1954. We're worried about Joseph McCarthy and a million other things. This bill about under God being added to the pledge is nothing new. In God we trust, and the motto, it's even less opposition because it seems to be just something that's at this point in the atmosphere. Who could object to this? There are light objections along the way. Some people say, well, isn't this crossing a line? They quickly apologize and get out of the way and are steamrolled over. This happens without much opposition at all.
Niki, do you want to talk a little bit about the pushback to this, particularly on First Amendment grounds, and maybe characterize where we are now in terms of our conversation about church and state?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that at the time, there wasn't a lot of organized pushback, right? You do have these sort of free speech, free religion grounds, but the 1950s isn't super hospitable to those arguments. The 1960s looks very different when conversations about atheism and really pushing back against this idea of American as a Christian nation starts to get more blowback. Then this conversation reopens in a way that it's not really being had in the 1950s. Yeah. And as to where that conversation stands, I mean, you know, people are always going to fight over national symbols and religious symbols. And when religious symbols are national symbols, they become even more feisty about them. There was this incident in, I think it was back in 2007 when the first dollar coins come out. Unlike other coins, it didn't have "In God We Trust" on it. And this idea of this secret erasure of God from what became known as these godless dollars is just one of the many conspiracies that burbles up about this kind of thing.
And this was reaffirmed, in 2006, Kevin, is that right? I mean, Congress sort of redeclared this. Do you ever see us changing our deistic motto in this country?
Again, I think at this point it's become so ingrained that a lot of Americans, again, don't even notice it or assume it has always been there. What I found in researching this and talking about this are a surprising number of people who believe that was the national motto that the founders laid down in 1789 or whatever, and it's been there ever since. And not that it's a relatively new addition. Again, it only gets on coins in the Civil War, and importantly, after the Civil War, it's left up to the Secretary of Treasury to put it on coins. It disappears from the nickel for 50 years in the 1880s. Teddy Roosevelt actually tries to take it off all coins, and there's a bit of a blowback there where he wades in. At this point, I think it's going to be there until America reaches the point where the majority of Americans aren't believers. And until we hit that point, it's gonna be there. There's the speed with which these things pass is amazing, and it would take an enormous will to undo them. I think.
Or when we become a cashless society.
There you go. Then you just have to sort of do the Pledge of Allegiance every time you tap your Apple Pay at a gas station. Yeah.
Do you not?
Good point. So one last little note that I think just kind of nicely points out how all these big conversations about our values sort of crash into each other. We are having a conversation, as everyone knows, about Confederate symbols and the Confederate flag, and, Mississippi, which recently decided to remove the Confederate portion of their flag. The governor's now pushing to replace that with "In God We Trust." And so we see all these symbols come crashing in, and we see this one, maybe be more solidified as a result of the conversation we're having about other symbols. Kevin, do you own any godless dollars? Any in your collection?
No, I don't hang on to dollars that long, and they tend to pass in and out of my wallet pretty quickly. I would love to see one. I've only seen them online.
Listeners, if you're looking for a gift for Kevin, now you know what he wants.
Honestly, yes. Cash always makes a lovely gift. I'll take it anytime. It's fine.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Do send your godless dollars to Kevin Kruse. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, as always, Nicole Hemmer.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Follow us on social media. We're posting a bunch of stuff on Twitter and Instagram every day at This Day Pod. Keep the ratings and reviews coming, or if you don't want to leave a rating or review and you want to send in a godless dollar, we will take that deal as well. Thanks to everyone who has reached out. You can email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. There's also a contact form at thisdaypod.com. We'll be back on Sunday with our special election-themed Sunday episode. Kevin will be back too, and we're going to discuss a notable speech Ronald Reagan gave in his 1980 campaign and what politicians are really talking about when they talk about states' rights. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.